Hello guys, I'm back with another fresh new gambit that you can play against the English opening by white pieces. So you're gonna start with pawn to e5, and here most players play knight to c3. If they play something else, then it is most likely to be pawn to g3 and going for this Fianchetto, which would actually most likely transpose into the same thing that we want. So let's just say knight to c3. Here I recommend a quite rare move. This move is only played by 0.6% of the players, and it is pawn to d5. So immediately sacrificing a pawn, which they are likely to grab, making this a legit gambit. And after that you are going to play pawn to c6, so offering another pawn, which according to Lichess statistics 3 out of 4 players are going to grab. And after that you can recapture with your knight, creating this sort of horse-like structure, with this being the head, the body, and of course the legs. So that's why I call this the Trojan Gambit, even though there is already in the chess terminology the Greek gift, which is referring to the Trojan horse as well. But anyways, if you don't know what I'm talking about, just read Iliad by Homer. What I like about this position is that you already developed a knight and both of your bishops are wide open. Actually, one more thing that you only want to see in chess, and that is your queen being wide open as well. Alright, now before talking about anything else, let me first show you the most common played moves by white. So here they usually play pawn to g3, trying to go for the light square bishop Fianchetto. You can continue with knight to f6, simple developing move. And then they usually continue with bishop to g2, and you can go bishop to c5. So what I like about this gambit is you get to play all the normal developing moves, nothing crazy, easy to remember, and they tend to mess it up in the near future. So here they play pawn to d3, and in this position I really like this move knight to g4. So with this you are obviously making a threat against the f2 pawn, and white has 3 ways how to deal with this, and that would be, well, knight to e4, protecting this, hitting this. Then there is just pushing the e3, protecting against this bishop. Or there is also the third option, and that is knight to h3, so covering the pawn this way. And from these 3 options only one is correct, and actually it is the least played one, so that's cool. So the correct move here would be to play knight to e4, but what white players tend to play here most is actually a mistake of pawn to e3, trying to block our bishop. But here we have a nice move, and that is knight to b4. So with this we are threatening to capture this pawn with a check, so white needs to deal with this. And they usually mess it up here, because the correct move here is to play king to d2 to protect this pawn with the king. Well, you're doing your opening right when you force your opponent to bone cloud their king on move 9. So what they try to do here is just push the d pawn, because it looks like a natural way of protecting this pawn, also hitting this bishop. But this is a bad move, because you can capture this pawn, and here they are not able to recapture back. They need to play once again knight to e4, which they most of the time fail to recognize, and they just capture this pawn. But after that you can recapture with the queen. So now checkmate is threatened, so they are kind of forced to exchange the queens here. And after that this position is winning for black. You are now threatening this move, you are threatening this move, and no matter what white does, one of these rooks is going to fall, and you will be up a material and winning. Alright, so what if they find the correct move and they play king to e2 in this position? Well, it's time to sack some more pawns, and you can play bishop to e6, offering this pawn. Now, there are no games in the Lichess database in this position, but I just wonder how many of your opponents will capture this pawn, because, that's the whole point of putting this bishop here, to have a threats against this long diagonal. So if they capture the pawn, here you have your rook under attack, which you are going to ignore, and you are just going to simply castle. So sacrificing a rook which they shouldn't capture, because if they do, here you can recapture with your queen. And now look, look who is the boss of this diagonal. It's our queen. So how do they deal with this pressure? Well, I would say pawn to f3 seems natural because it blocks this and it also attacks this knight. Well, not really because the pawn is pinned. But if they play this, you can once again just sack some more stuff and go rook to d8. Because if they capture your knight here, well, then your queen arrives to the g2 square with a check. So not even bothering to capture this rook, because this is just forced checkmate in 8 moves or so. So this is the kind of fun that you can have with the Trojan Gambit against some greedy players. Now let's go back all the way to the point where we played knight to g4 attacking the f2 pawn. So what if they play the correct move here and they play knight to e4, protecting the f2, also hitting our bishop? Well, here I recommend the move queen to b6, creating a battery and threatening the f2 pawn once again. Now white should capture this bishop, and after that you recapture with your queen, and since you are still hitting the f2 pawn, threatening a check, here they once again have an opportunity to mess this up and play pawn to e3. Because here you can once again jump knight to b4, and now you are threatening to jump to c2, forking the king and the rook. And actually there seems to be no good way for white to deal with this. And the engine is suggesting just to play pawn to h3, attacking the knight. So you can check them, and king to f1 is the best move. You can capture the rook and they will capture your knight. So right now we are up an exchange, and it is not winning still though, but you have a nice move, and that is bishop captures on g4. Seemingly just hanging our bishop, but they cannot really capture this because they hung just their own bishop. And after queen captures on c1, this is a check, so king needs to move, and we can win some more pawns with the tempo. Here king to f3 should be played, and after this you can even play knight back to c2. Seemingly once again hanging your material, because if they dare to capture this pawn, well, here you just finish them off with pawn to e4 check, and bye bye Mrs. Queen. Alright, let's rewind this all the way back to the point where we played knight to g4 hitting the f2 pawn, and let's discuss what happens if white goes for the third option, and that is knight to h3. So if they play this move, I'm sorry, but this is going to be the most boring line out of this gambit, because I haven't been really able to find any sorts of tricks or traps in this position. But the best continuation for black would be here to play pawn to a5. Thanks to this move, anytime your bishop is hit, it can hide on a7. And now you are also preventing this pawn to push. So there are no actual games in Leash's database, but I can just imagine everybody here is going to be playing short castle, and after this you can play pawn to h6. And your strategy is kind of to just not allow white pieces to move. So for example, this knight is completely stuck and it cannot move anywhere. And also this bishop now cannot develop to its usual square with the tempo on our queen. And well, you see, white is just kind of cramped, and you just need to get castled, get this bishop out, maybe develop your queen, and you can start going for some kind of attack. So even though the stockfish says this is 0-0-0, I would say black has some better attacking chances in this position, and I would recommend you to win by playing good moves, not blundering and just simply playing chess. Alright guys, let's go all the way back. Let's see this one more time. c4, e5, knight to c3, pawn to d5. And after they fully accept your gambit, we have, we have just been analyzing the most usual setup from white, which is g3, bishop to g2 and pawn to d3. What is actually nice about this, and I wanted to mention this, even if they start with, for example, d3, this is very likely to just transpose to the same position that we've been just looking at with a different move order. So just keep that in mind. But now let's talk about some other moves that white might try to play against you. So the second most played move here is knight to f3. After this, notice that we are just going to simply play all the standard moves. So knight to f6. Here d3 is the most played move, and after that, of course, bishop to c5. At this point, once again, most white players are going to go for this light square bishop fianchetto. They just love to play this idea. But it is not going to work for them well in this variation, because we can already surprise them with pawn to e4. So hitting the knight, but kind of sacrificing a pawn, right? Well, they shouldn't capture this pawn, although most players do. So first of all, if they capture with their knight, then you can capture the knight, and they, well, most of the time capture back, which once again they shouldn't, because here we have a crazy move. Bishop captures on f2 with a check. The king is forced to capture the bishop, and we are going to win the queen like this. So this is not playable for white. And if they decide to capture not with the knight but with their pawn, here we can capture their queen. So they are most likely to recapture with their knight in order to save their castling rights. And here, once again, our knight lands on b4. So threatening to fork the king and the rook. And once again, there is no good way for white to deal with this. And the best thing that they should do is to move the rook to b1 so that it doesn't get captured. And here we are going to deliver this check. So knight to c2 check. King is forced to go to d2. And we are going to just go back with our knight. And in this position, what they need to do is go back with their king to e1. But nobody so far played this move. Some players tried pawn to a3, harassing our knight, which walks into a checkmate in 2 after knight captures on e4. Notice how this king cannot move anywhere here. He can only go back, but then knight to c2 is checkmate. And if they didn't play pawn to a3, then they just try to develop something. For example, they tried to play knight to c3. And here we can just shock them with bishop to f5. Looks like a mouse slip, but this is exactly what we wanted to play. And if they dare to capture our bishop, we are going to get long castled with a check. And well, the king has only one square to go to if it wishes to move. And that's e1, which walks into a checkmate. So the only way to survive for white would be to start throwing some pieces in the way of this rook to hum 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 nyam nyam nyam. Alright, let's go back and let's see some other variations. So we just watched pawn to d3, and then the second most played move would be actually pawn to g3. So if white goes for their lovely bishop to g2 fianchetto. Well, we are going to still continue with our normal bishop to c5, and after the natural bishop to g2, we are going to play pawn to e4. So, asking a question, where is your knight going? Well, if the knight goes back, then that's a pretty bad move for white, and the only way forward would be to play knight to g5. But in this position, we have a nice and sound piece sacrifice with bishop captures on f2. So the king recaptures, and now knight to g4 check. Not only that, but also unleashing our queen to pick up this knight on the next turn. So the king should go to g1, this is the best move, and after that we can capture this knight. The stockfish is saying that this is still better for white. I don't know really why, because the material is equal and actually it's white who has their king stuck on g1 square. But anyways, most people tend to mess this up and they continue with the natural knight captures on e4 with the tempo on the queen, where we can reply with the tricky queen to d8. Now, if white isn't careful and just play the most played move in this position, which is pawn to h3, this is a blunder because we can hit them with queen to d4 check. And, well, they cannot move their king because then here comes knight to e3, forking the king and the queen. And, of course, the pawn cannot capture this knight because, well, thanks for your queen anyways. So what they should do is block this check with their pawn, but we can grab this pawn. Their d-pawn is still pinned and the queen is under attack, so it needs to move. And after that we can capture this bishop. It is also discard check, so the king is forced to capture our knight, and afterwards we can just castle, get our king nice and comfy, and well, this is winning for black. Alright, so I think we just covered all the most common setups for white if they accept your gambit. Now let's talk about some other lines. For example, if they don't accept the gambit and they don't capture this pawn, well, what are they going to do? For example, if they continue with pawn to g3, so they are going for this Fianchetto once again, this is not going to be working well for them because here you have an option to push d4, hitting the knight, and actually people tend to blunder right away, and the most played move is knight to e4, which just sadly traps the piece on the spot on move 4. Yeah, and even if they capture the first pawn and after c6, here they will, try to go for the same thing. Here you can capture this pawn and they fianchetto their bishop, you push d4. Once again, most players are going to play knight to e4 blunder, which walks to f5 and the knight is trapped. So that's just a fun fact to know. And the last line that I would like to cover is, what about if they capture not with their pawn, but with their knight? Even though this is pretty rare move, I wanted to cover this because there are some crazy lines. So let's see this. After knight captures on d5, I would recommend to continue with knight to f6, because most players are going to capture your knight and you can recapture with the queen. Now here, the most played move is pawn to d3, just supporting the c4 pawn, opening up this bishop. Here you can continue with knight to c6, and usually they play knight to f3, because this gives them the option to develop knight to g5 with the tempo on the queen. So here you can continue with bishop to f5, and actually here there are two correct moves for white to play. One of them is to put queen on c2, so straight in the line of this bishop, or the second correct move would be to push this pawn. Let's talk about it later. Let's just see what's wrong if they play the natural bishop to g5. Well, here we are going to develop our bishop to b4, and with this move we are actually claiming that white just lost a tempo moving this bishop to g5, because now it has to go back. Blocking this check with the knight doesn't work because just queen captures this free bishop, so the bishop needs to go back to d2 to cover king from the check. Now we can continue with pawn to e4. They shouldn't really capture this pawn. What they should play is capture this knight and, this bishop, and let our knight jump to b4, which would be perfectly fine for us. But if they capture the pawn on e4, we can unleash some craziness and just go for a long castle. Letting them capture our bishop, which once again they shouldn't do, because if they do, here comes our queen to b2 joining the attack, and now there is like a ton of pressure against this bishop. So what should white do here? I don't know. I think most human reaction to this would be to play something like rook to b1 and try to kick this queen away. But here comes another crazy move. Rook captures on d2. So here I believe they will try to just capture the queen. I don't know. But here we go. Do you think we are going to capture the queen? No, we only capture the rook, but it is a discard check. And now they need to block this with a knight. And after that, our last piece arrives to the d file to join the attack. And now white is just toasted. Their only kind of move is to push the f pawn in order to have some escape squares for the king. And we can start the slaughter. So we capture with the bishop, it's a check. They can either give up the queen right away or they can move the king to f2, and after this check they can capture the bishop, but we are winning the queen back. And if we look at the material, somehow after all these sacrifices black is actually up a rook and totally winning. Alright guys, there is like a ton of different moves that white could try to survive our attack. And for the sake of the length of this video, I'm not going to go through them all, but I will make a liches study in the future where I will elaborate on these variations. I promise. But let me just show you one more funny line, and that would be after we played bishop to f5, I was talking about queen to c2 or pawn to e4 being the correct moves. So let's see pawn to e4. Here we have another crazy piece sacrifice, and it is once again going for a long castle, just letting the bishop hang there. And this time white can capture it, and after that we can play pawn to e4, so hitting this knight. And the stockfish here is yelling at white pieces, just give the piece back, just let them capture this knight and you will be fine. And the stockfish is saying that the white should here play bishop to e2. Well, who is going to be like that? That is not the human nature. They want a piece for free, they want to stay up a piece, right? So they are going to protect their knight and move it. Well, if they go knight to g5, then bishop to b4 check, and this is totally winning for black. But even funnier is if they play the correct turn move, and that is knight to d2. Here we are going to just capture the pawn on d3, and once again stockfish is out of his mind. He just wants to sack the bishop like this and says that this is perfectly fine for white and anything else is actually losing. So, well, what's wrong with the white's position if they just don't sack back? Well, the second most correct move, which is already losing, is, for example, queen to b3. But after that, our knight can jump to d4, hitting the queen, and the best thing that white can do in this position is to counterattack our queen with their knight. So knight to e4, here we can play queen to e5, so now we are pinning this knight, and here they should capture this pawn to d3, the only move for white. But after that we are going to play bishop to b4 check, king to d1 is forced, and now wherever our knight jumps, the best is to capture this pawn, but it doesn't really matter. Now we are winning the queen and the game is over. So this is one way to punish this. Alright guys, enough of the funny lines. Let me just briefly explain what is the refutation of this gambit. So if you are a white English opening player and you ever encounter this gambit, what you should do is, you should accept the first pawn, but you shouldn't capture the second pawn, but rather either give it up by playing knight to f3, but hitting this pawn, or you can also play the boring pawn to e4, trying to hold on to your material advantage. So that's it for this video, guys. I hope you liked this. I hope you learned something. I hope you will have fun attacking your opponents with these crazy gambits. Take care and goodbye.